Right now, your phone can warn you about a storm 3 days before it arrives. You get a buzz, a red banner, time to prepare. You trust that warning without even thinking about it. But on the 24th of August, in the year 79, thousands of people got no warning at all. And the way they spent their final hours is far stranger and far more human than you'd expect. This is the last night of Pompeii, minute by minute. Picture the town at noon. Bread is baking. Wine is being poured into clay cups at a roadside bar. Dogs sleep in doorways. Nobody looks up at the mountain. Why would they? Mount Vesuvius had been quiet for so long that people built vineyards on its slopes. They planted grapes in soil made from old eruptions and never once thought about what made that soil so rich. Pompeii was not a small town. It held somewhere between 11 and 20,000 people, depending on the season. It had public baths, a stone amphitheater, brothels, laundries, and a busy forum where merchants argued over the price of fish sauce. There had been an earthquake 17 years earlier in the year 62, one strong enough to crack temples and topple statues. The city had spent almost 2 decades rebuilding. If anything, people had reason to feel that the worst was already behind them. They had survived a disaster once. Surely that meant they understood the risks? They didn't. An earthquake and a volcano are not the same warning system, but the brain doesn't always know the difference. You survive one kind of danger, and some part of you starts to believe you understand danger itself. That belief is comforting. It's also wrong. Then in the early afternoon, the mountain opens. A column of ash and pumice shoots 20 miles into the sky. Witnesses later describe it as shaped like a pine tree, wide at the top, narrow at the base. That description survives because a young man named Pliny watched it happen from across the bay, and years later he wrote 2 letters describing exactly what he saw. Historians still use his account today. It's one of the earliest eyewitness records of a natural disaster in human history. His uncle, an admiral and naturalist, actually sailed a fleet of ships toward the eruption instead of away from it. He wanted a closer look, and he also wanted to rescue stranded friends along the coast. He never made it home. His nephew survived only because he stayed behind on the far side of the bay, close enough to witness the column of smoke, far enough to escape what came next. Curiosity pulled one man toward the disaster. Distance saved the other. That contrast alone tells you something about how differently people respond when the danger doesn't yet feel real. For the first few hours, Pompeii does not burn. It buries. Pumice stones, light and gray, rain down like hail. They pile up on rooftops. Some roofs groan under the weight, some collapse. People start doing what you might do if ash began falling outside your window right now. They check on neighbors. They gather belongings. They wait for it to pass. Here's the strange part. Many of them believe it will pass. The air by now is thick with sulfur. Breathing feels like inhaling a struck match. The sky, even at midday, has gone the color of dusk, yet the streets are not filled with screaming. They're filled with people making small, practical decisions, tying cloth over their mouths, carrying lamps in daylight because the ash blocks out the sun, deciding whether to grab the silver or the grain. Why would you run from your home, your business, your entire life, based on falling rocks that don't seem to be getting worse? Waiting felt reasonable. Waiting felt safe. It wasn't. By early evening, the pumice is knee-deep in some streets. Roofs are failing across the city, and still, most residents haven't left. Archaeologists have found groups of skeletons huddled together in cellars, in storage rooms, in the corners of houses. Not fleeing, sheltering. They were doing exactly what you'd do during a storm. Get low, get inside, get safe. Except this wasn't a storm. Sometime after midnight, the eruption column can no longer support its own weight. It collapses. What comes down is not more falling ash. It's a pyroclastic surge, a fast-moving cloud of superheated gas and rock that can move faster than a car on a highway. Researchers studying the eruption, including volcanologist Giuseppe Lorenzo, have reconstructed multiple surges that swept through the region that night, each one more violent than the last. The people sheltering in cellars, believing they were safe, were directly in its path. This is where the story gets uncomfortable, but it matters. In 2001, a paleopathologist named Pier Paolo Petrone examined skeletal remains from Herculaneum, a neighboring town hit by the same eruption. His research suggested that many victims died from the extreme heat of the surge itself, not suffocation. Death, according to his findings, may have come almost instantly, not merciful exactly, but fast. Later analysis of bone samples found traces consistent with temperatures well above what a human body can survive for even a few seconds. Muscles contracted instantly from the heat, which is why so many of the plaster casts show bodies twisted into unnatural, almost frozen postures, arms bent, backs arched, hands clenched. It wasn't fear that shaped those poses, it was heat acting on tissue faster than the brain could register pain. You might expect this to be a story about panic. It isn't, not entirely. Some residents did run early and they survived. Skeletons found along the roads leading out of the city, clutching coins, jewelry, and house keys, tell you something about human priorities in a crisis. People didn't grab food first. They grabbed the things that proved who they were and what they owned. Even facing death, identity mattered. One skeleton, found near the Herculaneum boat sheds, still wore a leather belt with a small pouch of coins and carried a set of iron keys, likely to a home he would never see again. Another was discovered with rings still on her fingers. These weren't the choices of people in blind panic. They were the choices of people trying to hold on to something familiar while everything else fell apart. You do this too in smaller ways whenever your world feels unstable. You reach for what's known. For over 1,500 years, Pompeii stayed buried and forgotten. Vineyards grew above it again. Farmers plowed fields without knowing an entire city lay beneath their feet. It wasn't until the 18th century that workers digging a well accidentally struck ancient walls. Excavations began, slow and clumsy at first. Statues were pulled out and sold. Frescoes were stripped from walls like souvenirs. Wealthy European travelers treated the site like a shopping trip, taking home mosaics and pottery as trophies with no record of where they'd been found. For decades, Pompeii was mined for objects, not understood as a moment in time. It took until the 1860s for an archaeologist named Giuseppe Fiorelli to change how the world understood this place. Fiorelli noticed something odd in the hardened ash. Strange hollow pockets, roughly human-shaped, kept turning up as his team dug through the layers. Instead of ignoring them, he tried something new. He poured liquid plaster into the cavities and let it set. What came out were not statues. They were casts of the actual final moments of real people. A man curled on his side, one arm shielding his face, a dog straining against its chain, twisted in agony. A group of children pressed together in a room, as if huddling for comfort in the dark. Fiorelli's technique turned Pompeii from a collection of ruins into something closer to a photograph. A frozen second cast in plaster, showing exactly how ordinary people faced the end of everything they knew. Here's the detail that tends to stay with people longest. Many of the bodies weren't found in panicked sprints toward the city gates. They were found at home, in bed, at the dinner table, because for most of that night, staying put seemed like the sensible choice. The eruption didn't look like the end of the world. It looked like bad weather that would eventually stop. How do you plan for a disaster you've never seen before? You can't, not really. You respond to danger using the closest thing you've experienced. If you've only ever seen storms end after a few hours, you wait out what looks like a storm. Modern psychologists call this normalcy bias, the tendency to underestimate a disaster because nothing like it has happened to you before. It's the same instinct that makes people ignore evacuation orders during wildfires or stay in flooding homes because the water hasn't risen high enough yet. Your brain isn't built to imagine an ending it has never witnessed. The people of Pompeii weren't foolish. They were human, reacting exactly the way you might react, using the only reference points they had. Think about the last time you got a severe weather alert. Did you leave immediately or did you glance out the window first, decide it didn't look that bad yet, and keep doing whatever you were doing? Most people wait for confirmation before they act. Confirmation almost always arrives too late. By sunrise on the 25th, the city was gone. Not destroyed in the way a fire destroys a building, leaving char and ash to blow away. Buried, sealed, preserved in a layer of volcanic material up to 20 feet deep in some places. The very thing that killed Pompeii is the same thing that protected it from time, war, looting, and weather for nearly 2,000 years. That's the twist most people never expect. Destruction and preservation in this case were the same event. Walk through Pompeii today and you'll see bakeries with loaves still shaped in the oven, bathhouses with intact mosaic floors, political graffiti scratched into walls complaining about local elections in language that would feel familiar at any dinner table today. You'll see fast food counters, the ancient version of a corner shop with holes in the marble countertops where clay pots once held hot food for busy customers grabbing lunch on their way somewhere else. You'll find love notes scratched near doorways, insults aimed at rival shopkeepers, a crude drawing of a gladiator next to someone's boast about winning at dice. None of it was written for you to read 2,000 years later. It was written by people who assumed, like you do, that there would always be a tomorrow to come back and read it again. It looks less like a ruin and more like a city that simply paused. And maybe that's the real reason this story keeps pulling people back in, century after century. Pompeii isn't frightening because it shows you something alien. It's frightening because it shows you something familiar. People going about an ordinary day, trusting that tomorrow would look like today, making calm, reasonable decisions based on everything they'd known up to that point. You do the same thing constantly without noticing. You assume the routines that have always held will keep holding. You wait because waiting has worked before. Most days it does. But somewhere in that gap between what has always happened and what could happen next, entire cities have vanished in a single night. Not because the people living in them were careless, because they were exactly as cautious and exactly as hopeful as you'd be in their place. Tonight, when you check the weather on your phone before deciding what to wear tomorrow, you're doing something the people of Pompeii never had the chance to do. You're not smarter than them. You're not braver. You just have a warning they didn't. Use it.